Have him come up. Thank you, Dr. Well, thank you, Travis, and thank you all. For the last, I don't know, 12, 15 years before COVID struck, I used to visit Japan on average about once a year. Sometimes I missed, but other times I went maybe twice a year. And then, of course, COVID put an end to all of that, at least temporarily. Now, you may remember that just last month was the 10-year anniversary of the Fukushima disaster. Although we really should call it the earthquake and tsunami disaster, but we tend to remember it as the nuclear power plant disaster. And if you think just a few months earlier than that, think back just a few extra months, August of 2020 was the 75th anniversary of the Hiroshima nuclear bomb. Now, the last trip that I took to Japan in September 2019 was to Hiroshima. And I've been there 3 times now. By the way, it's a beautiful city. As you might expect, it's brand new. It's been rebuilt entirely. It's a gorgeous city. And indeed, I would have to say it's one of my favorite cities in the world. And so I thought, since these 2 cities are so connected, they're connected in a negative way because of the radiation and nuclear history that connects them, I thought the club might want to hear a little bit about the history of those 2 places, what connects them, and my experience of being in both places. I was in Fukushima, in the nuclear power plant, just a couple of years after the meltdown there. And I've got a couple of photographs and a couple of stories to tell about that experience. So being in Hiroshima and being in Fukushima, I thought you might like to hear some of those stories. So let's start with Hiroshima. It's the lessons that were learned about what happened at Hiroshima that were so relevant to inform the authorities about what to do at Fukushima 65 years later. Now, this is an aerial shot of modern day Hiroshima. This is a Google Maps picture. Don't worry about the white circles. I'll explain those in a moment. But can you make out that T-shaped bridge there, right in the, almost in the center? As you can see, Hiroshima is a series of islands with rivers flowing through. That T-shaped bridge was the target for the bomb. Colonel Tibbets in Enola Gay, whenever I drive past Enola here in Oklahoma, I always think of Enola Gay, the bomber. And that was the target, that T-shaped bridge. The wind was blowing a little that day, and the bomb actually hit where that red dot is, ground zero. So it drifted a little bit. And by the way, while I've got this larger scale, the hotel where I stayed in is just about here. And this is just a few blocks. This is no more than 15 minutes walk. If I give a blow up, the T-shaped bridge is just here. And here is ground zero. My hotel is now off the picture down here. So this is ground zero. The last time I was there, I thought I have to go and try and find ground zero, the hypocenter, as they call it. And this street is a nondescript modern street. It's very narrow, modern buildings, high-rise buildings. And my wife and I were walking along it, looking for anything that told us that this is where the bomb fell. And a very nondescript marble plinth. It's only about this high. And I actually walked past it at first. And then I spotted it at the corner of my eye, turned back, had a look, and there's a little brass plaque on the surface of the plinth in both Japanese and English. And it says 600 meters above your head, the first atomic bomb fell in August 1945. And I defy anybody who reads that not to look up. And I did. It's as if you're expecting to see it falling. And of course, all you see is clear blue sky. It's a beautiful day. This was September 2019. But 600 meters above that spot, the first atomic bomb exploded. It was an airburst. And as I say, the target was just up here, but it exploded 600 meters above that spot. Now, this place is called the Atomic Bomb Dome. What that is the site of this building, which is the Hiroshima Prefecture Industrial Building. That's what it looked like before the bomb. That's what it looked like after the bomb. And that's what it looks like now. I took that photo and they left it. They left the skeleton of the building as a memorial to the bomb. The first time I visited, we were in a bus arriving at Hiroshima. It was dusk. You could still more or less see, but the lights were on in the buildings. And we were tired. It had been a long journey. I didn't know where we were in Hiroshima. I just knew we were there. And suddenly we caught a glimpse of this building. And I thought, oh my goodness, we're here. I realized that we were in the place where the bomb fell. So I saw that building. It was lit up. It was a really eerie feeling. I still don't quite know where we were, but we were on one of these roads and we could see it. This whole area here is now a memorial peace park. It's beautiful. It's a sort of place you would love to stroll on a peaceful Sunday afternoon. It's got one of the best war museums, if there's such a thing as a good war museum. The first floor is generally World War II. The second floor is the bomb museum. If ever you're there, I recommend you go, but don't expect to come out smiling. It's a very somber museum. My wife and I went and we didn't speak for 30 minutes afterwards. Anyway, so that's Hiroshima today. This is where the bomb fell. And this, of course, is what it looked like at the time. The X is more or less where the bomb fell. Here's the T-shaped bridge. Here's the island, which is now the Memorial Park. Our hotel, as I said, is around about here somewhere. And one of the things you notice about this picture, don't quite know exactly when it was taken, but not too long after the bomb fell, there is no rubble. It's not been cleared away. There was no rubble. It disappeared. Hiroshima disappeared. It vaporized. You look at rubble of Berlin, Dresden, Cologne, there's rubble. There is none here. So these circles, I'm not going to talk about this circle here. First of all, it's too gruesome after lunch. But in this circle, all the deaths were due to heat and shock waves. By the way, a somewhat Oklahoma connection. You've heard of the F scale for tornadoes. The F stands for what the Japanese scientist, what is it? Fujita? He was an army engineer. He was sent into Hiroshima to look at the damage. And from the damage of the surviving buildings, he figured out the wind speeds. He then took that expertise, went to Nagasaki, did the same thing. And after the war, he came to the United States and used that expertise to figure out the wind speeds in storms And from that, he developed the F scale for tornadoes. But it all started here. But there were no survivors here. And this is about 1 kilometer circle. Outside that is where I'm going to talk about this circle here. And this is where the deaths due to radiation occurred. They survived the heat, they survived the shock, they were very badly injured from burns and from the trauma from the shock, but they didn't die of those injuries. They died of radiation. So that's what we're going to talk about. And beyond that were the survivors. Now, I've got nice, neat circles here. It wasn't like this, it was a distribution, as you can imagine. But more or less, this is what it looked like. So in this circle here, let me just say that the deaths were by primarily the heat. And the heat was incredible. 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit in that central region. I'll just let you imagine what that was like. This is why there's no rubble. It just evaporates it. So in this outer ring, toward the inner part of that outer ring, where the people survived the heat, survived the shock wave, even though they were badly injured, they died more or less the day later. But they died not from those injuries. There were large numbers, thousands died a day later, all of the same symptom. And they died because their whole bodies shut down completely. The entire nervous system just shut off. Perhaps I should hold this. Their entire nervous system just completely shut down. We now know that what happened was the brain neurons were totally destroyed. And look at this number, 20,000 or more than 20,000, something called millisieverts. Don't worry about what a millisievert is. It's just a unit describing a dose of radiation. Just look at the number 20,000 and remember that number. More than 20,000 kills the brain. Once the brain dies, everything dies. And that's what those people died of. It killed all the neurons in the brain, and those poor people died of that. And they died in huge numbers the first day. And then the second day, the deaths dropped off dramatically. And the doctors who survived, about 10% of the doctors in the city survived. About 5% of the nurses survived. About 10% of the hospitals survived. And all the survivors went to those hospitals and treated by those doctors. So the doctors were puzzled. Why did all these people die in such a fashion? They did not know. Well, a week or so went by and there was a lull in the number of deaths. And they thought, well, perhaps we're past the worst. And then a week later, the number of deaths shot up again. Now, all these people again died of the same symptoms, but these symptoms were gastrointestinal symptoms. The gastrointestinal system completely shut down. Now, these people had what we now know are doses in the range of about 10,000 to about 20,000. Not high enough to kill the brain, but high enough, we now know, to kill something called the villi in the digestive system. Now, the villi are like blades of grass, if you like. Think of blades of grass, but they're in the digestive system, and they pass the food along, and they absorb nutrients from the food and pass it into the bloodstream. Well, as they pass food along, they wear down. The villi do. They wear down from the top. But they grow from the bottom. And it takes about a week for the villi to wear down, and new cells grow at the bottom to replace them. Well, at these doses, the cells at the bottom were killed. And so the villi wore down and they were never replaced. And so no nutrient could ever be absorbed by the body. And these people died of starvation and malnutrition and all symptoms associated with a complete shutdown of the gastrointestinal system. Since it takes a week for the villi to grow, the symptoms didn't show until a week later. And then there was a second peak. And that lasted for about a week. And then it peaked and it died off again. And again, the doctors thought, well, now perhaps we're past the worst. Well, about 3 weeks later, the deaths rose again, a third peak. And this time, this peak was due to anemia. The blood system closed down. They lost all their blood cells. This kind of problem was due to the fact that the bone marrow was no longer producing white or red blood cells. And they had massive anemia, massive infection, and they died because of that, massive numbers. Now it takes about a month to replace our blood cells. And in a normal, healthy person, we are replacing our blood cells more or less once a month. But if that stops, then about a month after that stops, you will die. And that's what happened here, because that happens at doses up to about 10,000 millisieverts. And the further out you are, in this case, on the edge of this area, that's the dose that they received. Now, on the lower end of that dose, around about 1,000 to, let's say, 5,000 millisieverts, they could do a complete blood transfusion, and some of those were saved. Nowadays, we can do bone marrow transplants, and we can save more patients who have these doses. But those days, of course, they couldn't do that. By now, the doctors knew they were dealing with radiation sickness. Prior to that, they'd never seen anything like these problems. Outside this were the survivors. Now, the survivors hadn't had these very high doses. They were not, therefore, dying of what we now call acute radiation syndrome. Acute radiation syndrome is central nervous system syndrome, cut down the brain function. Gastrointestinal syndrome, cut down the function of the gastrointestinal system, or it's called hemopoietic syndrome, where you cut down the blood cell regeneration. All those are acute radiation syndrome, plus lesser effects like vomiting, hair loss, cataract formation. Those are not lethal. But beyond that, you get doses which are not acute radiation syndrome producing doses, but the danger now is cancer. And cancer is, it's what we call a stochastic problem. Maybe you'll get it, maybe you won't. Now, this population of survivors, both from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and their offspring, we're now on to the second, maybe third generation of offspring from the survivors. is the most studied cohort, medically studied, available anywhere in the world for these effects. And by studying them and by calculating how much dose they received, the medical community is now pretty sure they know what the likelihood of cancer is if you are exposed to radiation. And that likelihood is 0.005 per millisievert. Now, again, don't worry about what a millisievert is, but I will mention that we get exposed all the while to radiation. We're being exposed now. You were exposed when you were in your mother's womb. Radiation's all around us. By the way, I saw in the newspaper the other day, you've heard about this toxic waste pool in, is it Florida, that's leaking? A reputable newspaper said a radiation flood because it's radioactive. So that piqued my attention, and I read the article, and it said not only is it toxic, but it's full of natural radiation. Oh my goodness, everything's full of natural radiation. That's why they call it natural. Another way of saying the same thing was there's no more radiation in the pool than there is anywhere else. Anyway, the thing is, oh yeah, I was going to say the natural radiation in my office at OSU is 1,000th of a millisievert per day. So roughly two of those, 2,000ths of a millisievert per day. So in other words, 2 millisieverts in 3 years. So that's more or less what we get exposed to here in Stillwater. It's very low in Stillwater. In other parts of the world, it's much higher than that, but it's natural. We can't avoid it. It's just where we are. Anyway, at Hiroshima, the survivors, the highest dose of the survivors was about 5,000 millisieverts, which means that there's about a 25% chance that they will get cancer over their lifetime from, specifically from radiation. But I have to tell you that even if you had no radiation exposure in your life, your chances of getting cancer are about 25%. That's just the way it is. But this is, if you do get this much radiation, this is on top of that, all right? Now, with all that knowledge from Hiroshima and from Nagasaki, what about Fukushima? First of all, what happened at Fukushima? Well, it started off with the earthquake, which was very high, a 9.0 earthquake with lots of afterquakes, an enormous tsunami, which did terrific damage. This is an old slide. At that point, they were estimating 15,000 dead. There were a lot missing. The final death toll, they now have settled on about 20,500 from the tsunami, just the tsunami. I took this photo on the way to the power plant, and this is the real cause of the problem. The power plant has electricity to power the functions of the power plant that comes into the power plant. It doesn't provide its own electricity. Makes sense, because if the power plant had to shut down, how is it going to provide its own electricity if it's shut down? It's got to have an external supply. Well, this was the external supply, and the earthquake made all the power lines, this is one of the transmission lines, collapse. So its external supply of power was shut off. The reactors closed down immediately. They tripped, but you can't turn a nuclear power reactor off just like that. because they're so hot, thousands of degrees. This is one of the Japanese slides. So here's the transmission line. The transmission line failed. I don't know whether you can read that, but the internal emergency generators kicked in. These are diesel generators. They kicked in to power emergency power. Everything so far, so good. And then the tsunami hit. The reactor is right on the coast, and it had a breakwater which is about, let's say, be generous, let's say 6 meters high. The tsunami was estimated to be 14 meters high, so it overpowered the breakwater. The diesel generator, the top of it, was at about 10 meters above that. The turbine building was about 20 meters high, and the reactor building was about 40 meters high, but the wave, when it hit, was 46 meters high. So it overwhelmed everything. Now, there was a big argument to say, was this a natural disaster or was this a man-made disaster? Well, obviously, it's actually both. It was a natural disaster that the engineers didn't plan for, and therefore you could say it's both. Well, the result of this is that the diesel generator rooms flooded. Now, there are 6 reactors at Fukushima. 4 of them flooded. The other 2 were up a hill slightly, and they survived. The 4 that did not survive were these, numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the sequence was, we had the earthquake and tsunami, the external power, and then the emergency power were lost. The reactors shut down. Because the power was lost, you couldn't cool the reactors. The fuel rods overheated. The cladding on the outside of the fuel rods overheated and gave off hydrogen gas. The hydrogen gas exploded, and it blew off the roof, first of all, of reactor number 1. Now, this is a chemical explosion, not a nuclear explosion. And it did not blow up the reactor. It blew up the building that contains the reactor. Then reactor number 3, the same happened. Reactor number 2, the same happened. And reactor number 4, the building caught fire. Didn't explode, but it caught fire. So all these 4 reactor buildings had something wrong with them. By April 6th, so I don't know what day that is, almost a month later, by now they were pumping nitrogen gas to stop the fires. They were also pumping seawater in to try to cool the rods, but that's not a long-term solution. Seawater is corrosive. So you can't pump seawater around the cooling rods. You'll corrode them and you'll have massive leaks. The cooling water does get radioactive as you circulate it. So you've got to store it somewhere. Oh, this is a picture of reactor number 1. You saw that on television. A nuclear explosion. It wasn't, it was a chemical explosion. And the reactor was intact. Not like Chernobyl. At Chernobyl, the reactor blew up. This is where the contamination went, because there was radioactive material that was released, and the wind was blowing to the northwest. This is the contaminated area. At first, they just put a semicircle around it, but then they mapped out where it actually went. The green areas, they've allowed people to come back in. The red areas, the still evacuation orders are in place, And in the blue areas, they don't know when, if ever, they'll be able to go back. This is how they've done the decontamination in the areas that sprayed down all the buildings to wash the radioactive dust off the buildings. They've dug down about 2 meters and removed all topsoil. They've put the topsoil into plastic bags, and they've put the plastic bags in farmers' fields and covered them up. I took this picture from the bus, and this is a Russian scientist here, and they've just covered them up. And as far as I know, 10 years later, they're still there. What do you do with it? And Japan's a small country. What do you do with this stuff? As we did the tour, it was interesting. We got on the bus just to the north of Tokyo. Traffic in Japan is horrendous. But as we got closer and closer to this place, I realized after a while, there's not another single vehicle on the road. We were in the evacuation area. Nothing. And then we started noticing buildings that look like this. This is earthquake damage in a town called Tomioka. We got out to have a look around, and we saw things like this. This is the tsunami damage. This is 2 years after the still there. Now, we're all used to seeing this as tornado damage, but not 2 years after the tornado. This may have even been 3 years. I can't quite remember now. There's more of it. I was really surprised to see this damage still there. Here we are on the bus going to the nuclear reactor. This looks normal now, doesn't it? Face masks. At that time, we all felt rather awkward with face masks on. And that was our protective gear, by the way. We had plastic over our shoes and face masks, and that was it. And we all had, you can see the lanyards around our necks, we all had radiation detectors. Now, this bus is full of physicists, radiation physicists. Sorry, time's getting on. And these guys loved this stuff. They all had their own personal Geiger counters, and you could hear them going, oh, we've got those. You know. Even though we're all trained, I tell you, we were all a little bit nervous. This is reactor number 4. The concrete there is the reactor. This steel stuff is what they had built for robots to go in through the roof and pull out the fuel rods. They're still doing that now. These are the storage tanks for the water. These are some of the crazy scientists. She's from Croatia, the Japanese. He's from Austria. He's from Switzerland. Newspapers. Out of control. Reactors on the brink. Panic. Death toll climbs. So let's have a look at the death toll. Oh, these are the radiation spikes. And I want you to look at the numbers. Dose rate. Now this is rate. Millisieverts, that number again, per hour. So not total, but per hour. Here are the spikes. This, by the way, is what you get with normal medical procedures. CT scans, chest x-rays, etc., just for comparison. This is my dose record. This is when I was outside that building with the cantilever structure. Oh, this is what I flew over on the flight. Now, I'll give you the summary. I got far more dose flying to Japan than I got walking around the nuclear reactor. Far more. Right. Question. How many deaths, due to radiation from the reactor accident? It is. All right, shout out an answer. What do you think? 0. Nobody has been killed. How many deaths are projected due to cancer out in the future? What do you think? See, 2,500. Zero. The doses simply are not high enough. They're just not high enough. This is for the general public. A couple of guys got doses to the thyroid that were high enough to cause thyroid cancer, not high enough to kill them. And you can treat thyroid cancer. By the way, how do you treat thyroid cancer? With radiation. You kill the thyroid. So nobody will die because of the Fukushima reactor accident. Now, how many doses how many deaths just in the prefecture around Fukushima because of the tsunami? Remember, 20,000 throughout Japan, but how many deaths just in that area? What do you think? Yeah, 1,750. This is the Fukushima disaster, not the reactor. And finally, this one. All those people were evacuated. How many people died because of the evacuation? Yeah. Now, this is due to heart attack because of the stress, suicide because of the stress, people in hospitals who were ill, who died because they moved from one hospital to another, people who were on critical care in the hospitals who had to be taken off critical care to be evacuated. And the official estimate is over 2,500 people. I'm not blaming anyone. It's just a matter of fact that they evacuated these people and 2,500 of them died. And finally, a nice picture to end on. This young lady got her degree from Hiroshima University on assessing how do you figure out how much radiation people got in an accident. She actually did part of her PhD work here at OSU in my lab, got her degree from Hiroshima, and that costume, believe it or not, is her graduation gown. Isn't that nice? She herself is from the Philippines, but it's a nice picture to end on. So I'll hang around if any of you have questions. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Dr. McKeever, for your information. I think everyone found that as interesting and as informative as I did. We appreciate it. I know a lot of people were excited about it today, and you certainly didn't let us down. As you know, we support literacy here at the Stillwater Frontier Rotary, and so we'll be donating a library book in your honor to the Stillwater Public. Further from the club?